very few people who in this world will have seen a total eclipse of the sun. I estimate that it's 1 in 100,000 people. And now you are within a few months of joining that rather elite club. And I think you're going to enjoy it. How many here have seen a total eclipse of the sun before? Okay. See, relatively few, even though one of them is my wife, who has been dragged to several. So let me tell you a little bit of a story by way of beginning. The year is 1918. It's before radios. It's rural Kansas. And Florence McPherson is a 13-year-old who has a younger brother, and they are playing outside on a clear summer afternoon. And the sky begins to darken. And the mother, noticing that in a cloudless sky in the middle of the day, it's getting darker, yells for the children to come in. And the father, who's been out weeding the cornfields, comes running in, and they all huddle together as it gets very dark outside. They thought the world was coming to an end. It was the total eclipse of 1918. They just simply had no news, had no way of knowing what to expect. And so that's how shattering, that's how odd a total eclipse of the sun can be. So let's start our way toward a total eclipse. How many here have seen a partial eclipse of the sun? Almost everybody. And a number of people think that have seen a partial and think that it's a total. I'll tell you how to tell. Ask them what they thought of it, and they'll say, oh, it was interesting. That's not a total eclipse of the sun. You'll see why. It does look, at the beginning of the partial phases, as the moon begins to move in front of the sun, it looks like it's some kind of dragon. That's what the Chinese said, taking bites out of the sun, more and more bites. And at first, it's just a day, an ordinary day, and the sunlight, really the light of the day, doesn't begin to decrease markedly until about 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes before the eclipse. Then you notice that strange things are happening. The sky begins to have a kind of steely gray color to it, and the color begins to fade from the grass and the trees. It becomes a rather steely color also. And off to the west, there's a growing column, a growing pillar of darkness. It's the shadow of the moon coming towards you. And then all that's left is a tiny sliver of sunlight left. The moon has covered almost the entire sun. It's the diamond ring effect. And as this is happening, the corona is beginning to appear. You can see storms in the atmosphere of the sun. And then all that you see of the surface of the sun are little dots, little beads. They're called Bailey's beads. The sunlight now can only shine through valleys on the moon, between the mountains. And you see the storms, the prominences in the solar atmosphere. Different, every eclipse from the one that was before. And then finally you have the corona fully emerged. You can still see the prominences on the edge of the sun shining out from behind the moon that covers it. And the thing about it is, this corona that you can never see on an ordinary day or any other day except during a total eclipse of the sun. The corona is different, one eclipse to another. You'll never see the same one twice. And when the sun is totally eclipsed like this, it looks as if it's a hole in the sky. It looks like a black hole, and you can see outward into infinity. Such a strange feeling. You can see, I think, why Florence McPherson at 13 and her family were really quite startled by this darkness in the midst of the day, even though they didn't see the corona. They didn't see all these other effects. Here is the Chinese version of an eclipse with the dragon eating the sun. In India, they had a different myth for solar eclipses. This is Rahu, who is a demon. And he very much envied the gods. The gods were mortal because they drank Amrita, the nectar of immortality. And so one day he snuck into a dinner party of the gods and sidled over to the table where the urn of the nectar was and poured himself a drink. But just as he was doing that and about to take a sip, the sun and the moon ratted him out. They noticed him, reported him to Vishnu. Vishnu took out his discus, threw it, and went right through the neck of Rahu. His body fell to the ground dead, but he had Amrita in his mouth, so his head became immortal. And his head flew off into the heavens, and he was very angry at the sun and the moon, so he spends his time chasing them down, and whenever he can catch up with them, he eats them. There is one difficulty, as you can see from this picture, however, and that is when he eats them, it goes in his mouth and out his throat, and the sun and moon reassemble each other. For the Chinese then, for the Indians, this was an explanation of why there would be these terrifying events. People were recording them in ancient times too. This is a cuneiform tablet of the Babylonians, about 750 BCE. They were writing down every eclipse of the sun and the moon that they could see. And by about 150 years later, they had enough records so that they could see that there was a pattern, that if you had one eclipse and then you counted 18 years, 11 days, you would have another eclipse. And in that way, they were able to, by about 600 BCE, predict eclipses of the sun and moon, even though many of them, especially the eclipses of the sun, would not be visible from the area of Babylonia. The Chinese did much the same thing. They recorded eclipses on bones called oracle bones. This is a record, I cannot read it, I confess, of an eclipse from 1192 BCE. It took them a little longer than the Babylonians to put all their records together and recognize that they too could predict eclipses, even if they didn't, as the Babylonians didn't, know exactly how eclipses come to be. In the New World, the Maya were able to predict eclipses of the sun and moon. They also kept records, and quite amazing records, even though we only have a tiny bit of their wonderful writing left to us, only 4 or 5 books. This is the Dresden Codex, and I think you can see, well, thanks to John, I can actually point it out. Here, 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 and here are glyphs. And if you notice carefully, this is the sun right there. It's light, then it's dark, and what's happening is it's being swallowed by a dragon or a great serpent. And down here at the bottom are the Mayan numbers, counting the number of days till that predicted eclipse. Quite an amazing accomplishment. People always wonder whether Stonehenge was this kind. We know it was an astronomical monument. Its alignments are too good to be anything but. But exactly what they did with that astronomy, besides perhaps be able to demarcate seasons, we're not sure. I cannot tell you that they predicted eclipses, but look what they could do with the markers that they have. You can see, oops, sorry, went a little too fast there. You can see right there the heel stone, which would mark the position of the sun rising at the beginning of summer, the longest day of the year. This is looking down on Stonehenge. The heel stone would be off in this direction. Here is an artist's view of Stonehenge complete before it began to be taken away by people long ago for rocks for their houses and things like that. You can see in the lower right the heel stone, which was actually two heel stones to begin with. So you can see that there are a lot of alignments. And I call your attention particularly to these so-called station stones. They were some of the earliest positioning stones, as well as the two heel stones, before the Sarsen Circle and the Trilithons were built. We're talking the earliest part of Stonehenge dating to 3100 BCE. And here are some alignments that tell you what they were doing, which was watching the position of the rising and setting of the sun at winter solstice, summer solstice, and the moon, how far north of west it could set, how far south of west it could set, and as well as rise. And because of that, what would happen is, well, you've all noticed, what happens when the sun goes down and it's full moon, the moon is rising as the sun goes down. The full moon would then go across the sky as the earth rotates, and the sun would be coming up as the full moon goes down. Over the next 2 weeks, the moon, as it goes around the earth from west to east, would gradually be getting smaller and smaller, more and more a crescent shape, but it would also be changing its position in the sky until a few days before new moon, new at this, you would have the crescent, and that's 4 days from being new moon, and you could tell, the people at Stonehenge could tell, you could tell whether the moon is heading for the position where the sun is going to rise. Ordinarily, the moon would be passing a little above the sun's position or a little below the sun's position, and there would be no eclipse. But people like the people who built Stonehenge, if we want to make these observations, we can tell that at least there's the danger, if you want to call it danger, of an eclipse, even if we can't tell exactly where it will be, and even if we can't tell whether it will be a partial eclipse, what is called an annular eclipse, more about that later, or a total eclipse, which is what we have in store for us. People worry, and I worry a great deal about the people who worry about total eclipses of the sun. This is from 1976. This is from Australia. And if you can't see it very well, a newspaper article says, lock up children during the eclipse. Advice of an expert. And you think that this is peculiar to Australia. Nope. Indonesia, 1983. Canada, 1979. On and on it goes. In fact, let me think about this, 1999, people locked themselves away in Haiti because of a total eclipse of the sun, and suffocated because of carbon dioxide. inhalation. So I worry about the people who are worried, and you'll see why a little bit. This is also from Melbourne. This is from a Sydney paper in 1976. The only safe way to watch today's eclipse, and then it says television is the only safe way to watch today's eclipse of the sun. And I think you're going to see a number of people saying, watch it on television, watch it on television. Television is a wonder. Television does great things. Football games look great on television. Television does not begin, even high definition television, does not begin to have the resolution of the human eye. You will see the corona ever so much better with your eyes than you will on television. No offense, television. Here is the only person I could find in Australia who had his head on straight, a cartoonist, right? And it shows two guys who are blindfolded and tied up to poles. They're about to be executed by a firing squad. And one is saying to the other, luckily we're blindfolded. We won't harm our eyes by looking at the eclipse. The key is that a partial eclipse is just like any other day, a partial eclipse, any other day with the sun out. Would you go out and stare at the sun on an ordinary day? Of course you wouldn't. You would take some, if you're going to look at the sun, you would have some kind of eye protection, some kind of proper filter. And there's plenty of it available for very low cost. These are so-called eclipse glasses, and I put them on. I can't see you at all because it's black polymer, and the sun will shine through very nicely and comfortably without any harm to your eyes. Then, when the eclipse becomes total, you take them off because the moon is completely blocking the bright surface of the sun. No damage at all. You don't need any telescope. Binoculars are nice to have, but you don't absolutely need them. Your eyes are just fine. Here's another way of observing a partial eclipse, not a total eclipse, by using pinhole projection. You can see the partially eclipsed sun in the background, a little hole in a piece of cardboard projecting the image of the sun onto another piece of cardboard or onto the ground. So that works just fine. Also, if you have trees around you, notice if there's any light filtering through the leaves, through little spaces between the leaves, because it will make pinhole projections on the ground as well. You'll have crescent suns all over the ground around you. Or you can use a strainer spoon or a colander, or anything that will give you a small opening to allow it to make images of the sun. Those are real images. Those are not just simply letting a shaft of sunlight through. Here's this particular eclipse. And let me just say another word about eclipses. How lucky, unbelievably lucky we are on Earth that we have a moon the size we do and the distance we do. No other planet in our solar system does. And the result is that our moon is 400 times smaller in diameter than the sun. But it's also 400 times closer than the sun. So the moon and the sun are almost exactly the same angular size. And the result is, if the moon, as it goes around the Earth in a slightly elliptical orbit, if it's the right distance, it will completely block the sun. If it's a little bit too far away, it can't block the sun entirely, and you will have a ring of sunlight all around. That's an annular eclipse. Annulus means ring. And that's a lovely sight, but it's not a total eclipse of the sun. So here's the path of totality, and what's special about the 2017 eclipse, August 21st, is that it's the first time that a total eclipse of the sun has visited the American mainland since 1979. For 38 years, something as large as the United States has been without a total eclipse on its 48 contiguous states. As you can see, it comes ashore in Oregon. It hits no islands as it approaches. It goes across the country, and it leaves at Charleston, South Carolina, and again hits no islands as it leaves the Earth out in the Atlantic. The result is the United States is the only place to see this total eclipse of the sun. Here's the path of the eclipse, as you can see, close to St. Louis, through the southern half of St. Louis. The Gateway Arch does not manage to be in the path of totality. It does bring Nashville entirely into the path of the total eclipse. And here is Knoxville. Let me see if I can point it out here. There's Knoxville. We're a little bit outside the zone of totality. But if you go to Cookeville or Crossville or Athens or Madisonville or even Maryville, you will see a total eclipse of the sun. And what time will that be? That would be about 2:30 in the afternoon. Actually, I've got the exact times. I think it's more like 2:32 that the total phase starts, something on that order, approximately. What you want to do is situate yourself inside that zone of totality, that path of totality, which is about 68 miles wide, where we are.
As long as you're on the good side of that line, you get it, because it crosses West Knox County.
Right. No, you'll be all right. But as you get closer to the central line, the length of the eclipse, the total phase of the eclipse, lasts longer. Now, the interesting thing is, if you're right on the edge, the eclipse lasts a second or so. If you go 5 miles in, the eclipse is already lasting a minute. You go 10 miles in, and it's already lasting about a minute and a half. If you don't have to position yourself on the central line. You can be 10, even 20 miles off of the central line and still get 2.5 minutes or almost 2.5 minutes out of this eclipse. A total eclipse of the sun can never last longer than 7 minutes 32 seconds. But this one is not an exceptionally long or an exceptionally short one. The longest it will last, which is in southern Illinois near Carbondale, is 2 minutes 40 seconds. So here, if you're on the central line, say at Athens or very close, you'll get 2 minutes 38 seconds. You're only 2 seconds off of maximum. So kind of a nice thing. And we've been 38 years in a drought without total eclipses on the American mainland. 6 2/3 years from now, April 8th, 2024, put it on your calendars, we get another total eclipse of the sun. And this one comes up through Mexico, as you can see, up through Texas, the Midwest, right through Cleveland, and out through over Mount Katahdin in Maine, the terminus of the Appalachian Trail, and on out into the Atlantic Ocean. So, yes?
Does the wider swath indicate that'll be a longer period of time?
Perfect. Exactly right. This eclipse will last over 4 minutes. And through almost the entire United States, it will be longer than 4 minutes or longer. So, a quite amazing sight. And the key, folks, the key is don't settle for Knoxville. I love Knoxville, and it's plenty scruffy. But here we have a 99% total eclipse of the sun. A 99% total eclipse of the sun compared to a total eclipse of the sun is like going to your favorite musical and standing out in the lobby. You can sense the excitement, but you've missed the main event. So let me pause right there and, well, let me mention that I wrote a book on the subject, as Mike said, and it's called Totality, The Great American Eclipses of 2017 and 2024, and I hope it can be a guide for you. But there's lots of information on the web. You don't have to buy the book. Let me tell one more story, because the thing that strikes me always is that I can show you pictures, and these are wonderful pictures. I did not take any of them, so I can really credit the photographers. Many of them are by my co-author Fred Espenek. Great pictures, and he would tell you they don't begin to capture it adequately, not at all. I can give you wonderful statistics, like the moon being 400 times closer to us than the sun, but 400 times smaller. I can tell you 38 years since we've had a last total eclipse. I can say you're one of 100,000 if you have seen a total eclipse of the sun. What does it mean? People will still shrug it off. The only thing I've found that comes anywhere close to adequately depicting how impressive a total eclipse of the sun is the stories that people tell. Let me tell you one more story. The man's name is Glenn Schneider. And when this story took place, he was 14 years old, living in New York City, and he got permission from his parents in 1970 to travel with his astronomy club south along the coast of the United States to North Carolina to see the eclipse in that year. He brought with him, he studied hard, brought with him a motion picture camera, several cameras, other cameras, still cameras, a telescope, binoculars, filters, and a checklist of everything he was going to do for every moment as the eclipse was about to become total and then all the way through totality. He positioned himself very carefully. He was inside a football stadium. He climbed the stairs. This is East Carolina University. He climbed the stairs of the football stadium to see off to the west, to see the cloud of darkness building there, and recognizing it was coming toward him now. He ran down the steps. He had everything ready to go, and at that moment, the diamond ring appeared. The corona began to emerge into view, and he stood there and looked and froze. And he stood there looking for 2 minutes, 52 seconds, the entire length of the total eclipse. He did not start any cameras. He did not touch any buttons. He did not pick up his binoculars. He absolutely stared at the total eclipse of the sun. And when it was all over, he said to himself, I am never going to miss one of these events again. I'm going to see every total eclipse for the rest of my life. Glenn Schneider is now Dr. Glenn Schneider, professor of astronomy at the University of Arizona, principal investigator on many Hubble Space Telescope experiences. This year will be his 34th total eclipse of the sun. Thank you. Our questions? Yes?
I have a couple of questions. The weather prediction is, of course, more than 50% cloudy. Is there any way, can you get anything out of an eclipse when it's cloudy? And the second question is, tell us about the surface of the sun? I mean, from the, what it looks like is like it has a solid surface, but of course it doesn't. But how much is that? What is that surface that it reveals?
You're so right. Keep me in mind. Keep me mindful of the second part of the question, and I'll go for the first, because weather prospects are very important. Here are the critical things to do in terms of weather, because you're right. It's late summer, so we have a decent chance of having good weather, but we have afternoon thunderstorms that tend to build. There are a couple of factors there besides. Number one, look at the weather forecast a week in advance. These days, those weather forecasts are quite good. And watch it day by day. And then if you need to, if it looks like there's a front coming through and you can get to the other side of the front, or if there's if it looks like it's going to be really cloudy here but less cloudy somewhere else, less chance of thunderstorms, because those are pretty local thunderstorms. Stay mobile and move if you can early as possible, because everybody else is going to want to move too. Move to a different site. The neat thing about this eclipse is that it has chosen to follow Americans' interstates. It's got highways all over, and the United States is well equipped with highways, so it's not impossible to do the moving. So instead of seeing it as, a 50%, well, I'm just going to accept where it is, see if you can find a way to get to a place with better prospects for weather. If you cannot, you will still see a number of things happening. I haven't begun to go into them. First of all, it's really weird in the middle of the day to have the sun go out and to have it become dark. So that's something that you can observe. You may be able still to observe, even if the sun is behind a cloud, you may be able to see the shadow of the moon coming at you at more than 1,000 miles an hour and then going away from you at the end of the eclipse. The thing you want to see is the corona. But if you are denied that, there are still things to see. Like, for instance, the animals are completely confused. The birds will be flying about, squawking, not understanding what's happening. They may go to their nest, go to sleep. Cows will go on their own, walking back to the barn. Chickens will go to roost. You'll see night critters coming out. The bats will begin to fly. All kinds of things that will happen. Watch other human beings and their reactions too. Tell you more about that in just a moment.
With that, could you mention your own plans?
Peggy and I are going are going to Douglas, Wyoming. It's not that we don't like it here, but we were opting for just a little bit better prospects for weather. In the morning, you don't get as much buildup as you do in the evening. You have the Rocky Mountains there that have taken a good deal of moisture out of the air. You remind me of something that's very interesting, though. Thank you for doing that. And that is, eclipses are really peculiar in terms of weather. They can improve the weather for you. They can't wipe out a frontal system. They cannot wipe out a thunderstorm. But you know how on ordinary days you have cumulus clouds in the summertime? As the moon begins to move in front of the sun, the temperature begins to decline a little bit, and the clouds don't form as readily, and the clouds are always dispersing as well. And so a partial eclipse becoming more and more toward total will gradually cause a diminution of clouds. And so sometimes it will clear the weather a little bit for you. Now, the rest of the question was, does the sun teach us anything? And the sun is responsible for actually teaching us a great deal of what we know about the sun. I mentioned Bailey's beads. Francis Bailey wasn't an astronomer. He was just a really smart businessman in England in the early 1800s. And he got people excited about partial eclipses of the sun, an annular eclipse of the sun, and then it became there was a total eclipse of the sun a little bit later. And people realized suddenly that when the moon got in the way of the surface of the sun, you could see that there was more to the sun than we had ever expected before, ever suspected before. The prominences, what were they? Here was the corona. What was that? The outer atmosphere of the sun. Turns out it goes out millions of miles. Turns out the Earth is actually swimming around the sun in the outer atmosphere of the sun. So solar physics owes its history to the sun going into eclipse, as Dr. Riedinger can teach us, because he has taught all this many times before. So thanks to eclipses, we've learned an awful lot about the sun, and one other thing that the sun and its eclipses have taught us, and that is they proved general relativity. Einstein's general theory of relativity. There was already some evidence, but this was the first prediction of something that was then found to be true and absolutely sealed the deal on general relativity, the eclipse of 1919. And we can talk about that someday too. Any other questions? Yes?
You said that Professor Schneider had seen 30, I can't remember.
This will be his 34th.
And the first one was in 1970? You said he saw his first one in 1970?
Right.
So that's like almost one a year.
Almost. About one, there's about a total eclipse of the sun about once every year and a half.
Okay, just different places on the...
Yeah. For instance, next year, 2018, you want to see a total eclipse of the sun? Sorry, no total eclipse of the sun that year. 2019, let's go to South America, to Chile and Argentina. 2020, want to hear something perverse? 2020, where do you go? A little further south in Chile and Argentina. 2021, happy to suit you, Antarctica. 2022, I think, is no eclipse. 2023, it eclipses the farthest western peninsula of Australia and then goes through two parts of Indonesia that are almost always rainy. So, you know, it's really tricky to see it. And yet, you know what? There will be people going to Antarctica in 2021 for that total eclipse of the sun. You want to hear something preposterous? Peggy and I tried to make arrangements for a hotel in either Rexburg, Idaho, or Idaho Falls, Idaho, for reasons that we can talk about otherwise. And this was 3 years ago. Sorry, they were all completely booked 2 years earlier by groups from China and Japan. Does that tell you something about how impressive total eclipses of the sun are? This eclipse is within, as it goes across the United States, is within 1 day's drive of 275 million Americans, not counting the more than 100,000 people from foreign lands who will be coming. So you're in for one colossal treat, and I hope all of you get to see a total eclipse of the sun. Yes, and I'll come back over here in just a moment.
You give recommendations to people who want to photograph?
Who want to photograph. I'm sorry to do it. The book does, and other books on the eclipse do, and there's plenty of information online. I'm not a photographer, and so I would not be really good at that. But it isn't too technical. These days, a video camera can do it almost on its own. Let me show you some tricks, though, just if I can. How about that? Time-lapse photography. Now, you don't do that on your first eclipse. In fact, the recommendation is don't even try to photograph the sun on your first eclipse. If you've got a camera, take pictures of the people around you. It can be very beautiful, but this is from a person who has done it many times before and is a professional photographer besides. This kind of catching the phases, the partial phases of the eclipse coming and going. As you can see, it's kind of tricky. Sorry, Lisa. Wish I could do better. Sir?
Could you discuss the eye protection? I know I'm sure there are multiple vendors.
Right.
Probably all the same material, but,
Right.
It varies with buy one, it's $3.89, buy 250, it's 89 cents, and so forth and so on.
Yeah, even if you buy in onesie twosies, not very expensive. And the suppliers, most of the telescope suppliers will also supply that, probably from other vendors, but like Celestron, if you know the name, or Mead. But there are filter suppliers also, like Thousand Oaks is a name. American Optical Filters is another name. Rainbow Symphony, isn't that a name? Rainbow Symphony is another name. So those are just a few. And what you want to do, because you're right, that you want to make sure that it's really good eye protection. And what you do, by the way, is take it outside and, look at the sun for a moment or two and just make sure there are no holes in the material. I mean, if you glance up at the sun and glance away, you've done that as a kid, and you're not blinded. You just don't want to be staring at it. So, yeah, what you're looking for is black polymer. Used to be, what you'd get is Mylar. Everybody knows Mylar, right? Mylar is not well thought of these days because it has a tendency to develop little cracks and little holes in it that you don't see very readily. It's not awful if that's all you've got. Just make sure that it's a good piece. But the black polymer is better and gives you a more natural looking sun.
Is there some type of organization that certifies these? Past the standard by
No,
the FDA? It's not
I'm not aware of that, but these are filter companies that supply these things on a professional basis for things like welding and things like that. So I've never known there to be a problem with suppliers of truly black polymer. But of course, any kind of time when there's a big demand, so do check it yourself. If you've
Explain how you do it for your binoculars.
Oh yes, thank you very much. You can buy from these same suppliers the black polymer in patches, in sheets, and then you'd cut them up and make filters for your binoculars or telescopes. You'll need that for the partial phases, and then of course during totality, no need at all.
Is welders okay?
Welders' glasses,
Information on that.
yes, please.
I was reading about that. They recommend welders like grade 12 or 14, so you can get it from a welding supply company. You have to have 12, 14, they specify safe. So that's a little bit of information. If I could ask you a question.
Sure.
Has science found a satisfactory explanation for these spooky things called shadow bands?
Yes. Shadow bands are ripples that you see along walls or along the ground just before totality, just after totality. Many people don't look for them because while that's happening, you've got the diamond ring, you've got that sliver of a crescent, and it's moving into the diamond ring and Bailey's beads, and so they don't use those few seconds to look for shadow bands, but sometimes they're absolutely unavoidable. They just come swimming over you, and they're kind of wavy lines. They're very much like what you see in swimming pools. Have you ever seen those kind of ripples of light across the bottom of a swimming pool? That's kind of like shadow bands. The reason for shadow bands is that ordinarily the sun is an extended object, so you've got light coming from that side, light coming from that side, and so forth. But when the sun is a tiny crescent, it's almost a dot, and therefore the atmospheric turbulence and difference in density can cause an interruption in the light getting to the ground, and the result is that the light kind of pulsates and ripples, and that's what gives you the shadow bands. Isn't that strange? It's a fairly subtle thing, but some people put out big sheets as flat as possible and see if they can catch shadow bands happening. It's just one of the other little pieces of magic during a total eclipse.
I wonder, did you say it's going to be 7 minutes from the start of the partial eclipse till
It's about an hour and a quarter.
Oh, okay.
From the beginning, that first little notch, what's called first contact, until second contact, which is the beginning of totality. It's over an hour, depending on what eclipse and so forth, about an hour and a quarter. And then from the time of third contact, when totality is over, until the eclipse itself is over, the moon is now clear of the sun, that's another hour and a quarter, roughly.
And that's outside the band show?
No, that's what, inside the band, you will go through the partial phases. Inside the band, you get the treat. You get it going all the way to totality. Outside, they simply see a large partial eclipse. Yeah, if you're 100 miles out, yeah. So, yes?
What about the horizon?
What about the horizon? Thank you, because that's another wonderful thing to think about. During the total eclipse of the sun, right around the sun, it's dark enough to see the stars. You will see in this eclipse of the sun at least 4 bright stars that happen to be Mercury, Venus, Mars, and Jupiter, all fairly close to the sun, very nicely positioned, courtesy of the sun for this occasion. And you may see some other bright stars as well. But then, as you look further out toward the horizon, you'll see twilight colors, because those people out there where the twilight is haven't gotten inside the zone of totality, the path of totality. And so it's still twilight for them. And the thing about it is, any of us who have ever been to a total eclipse of the sun know that when it's over, people never say, well, that was nice. They say, and you know, well, I've seen one now. The thing they say when they're done screaming and clapping and crying is, when is the next one? Thank you so much.